In the autumn of 1944, the Carpathian Mountains became a killing ground where liberation turned into slaughter. Promised as a swift breakthrough to free Slovakia, the battle for the Dukla Pass instead devoured entire armies in 6 weeks of mud, fire, and blood. What really happened in Europe's forgotten mountain war, and why did victory cost more than defeat? In the summer of 1944, as the Red Army swept westward after the collapse of the German Eastern Front, the Carpathian Mountains stood as one of the last natural barriers before Central Europe. Beyond those ridges lay Slovakia, and behind it, the roads to Vienna and Prague. For the Soviet High Command, the Carpathians were not merely a geographical obstacle, but a political objective. The Kremlin aimed to assist the Slovak national uprising that had erupted in late August, a movement led by the Czechoslovak resistance and encouraged by Moscow's propaganda as the beginning of national liberation. At the same time, the Soviet command sought to outflank the German army group North Ukraine by breaching the Carpathians from the northeast and entering the Slovak plains before winter closed the mountain passes. The German command, aware of the strategic significance of the region, had long prepared for this possibility. The Dukla Pass, located between the Polish town of Krosno and the Slovak town of Svidnik, represented one of the few viable routes for mechanized movement across the Carpathians. In August 1944, the pass was fortified under the command of General Gotthard Heinrici, whose defensive expertise had been tested on multiple fronts. Army Group A, responsible for the area, positioned several experienced formations, among them the 1st Panzer Army, the 68th Army Corps, and elements of the 1st Hungarian Army, along the ridges and valleys that led toward Slovakia. The defenses consisted of reinforced trenches, minefields, and concrete pillboxes built into the slopes, supported by artillery and mortar positions, with excellent observation over the narrow roads below. For the Soviets, the offensive into the Carpathians was to be conducted by Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front. Within its structure, the main assault force was the 38th Army, under Colonel General Kirill Moskalenko, supported by the 1st Guards Army, and the Czechoslovak Riffer Corps commanded by General Ludvík Svoboda. Altogether, these formations numbered around 160,000 troops, with over 1,600 artillery pieces, 300 tanks, and 500 aircraft from the 8th Air Army. The German and Hungarian defenders fielded approximately 100,000 men, about 1,000 guns, and 200 armored vehicles, significantly fewer in number, but with the advantage of fortified terrain and prepared defensive lines. The political backdrop of the operation added urgency to the military plans. The Slovak national uprising had broken out on August 29, 1944, in Banska Bystrica, aiming to overthrow the pro-German regime and coordinate with advancing Soviet troops. Moscow viewed the uprising as an opportunity to establish a friendly government on liberated Czechoslovak soil. However, intelligence estimates grossly overestimated the insurgents' capacity to hold out. Reports reaching Konev's headquarters predicted that a Soviet advance could link up with Slovak forces within 5 days, cutting through German defenses and driving directly into central Slovakia. This assumption shaped the operational orders issued in early September, setting unrealistic timelines for a major mountain offensive against entrenched defenders. Terrain posed one of the greatest challenges. The Carpathians formed a rugged system of densely forested slopes, narrow valleys, and winding passes. Rain and fog were frequent in September, turning dirt roads into impassable tracks. Movement of heavy artillery required engineers to reinforce bridges and construct new supply routes, while mule convoys often replaced trucks to deliver ammunition and rations. For the German defenders, these conditions offered a natural extension of their fortifications. Observation posts on high ground allowed precise artillery targeting, and machine gun nests positioned along ridge lines created interlocking fields of fire that made frontal attacks costly. Both sides faced logistical constraints. Soviet supply lines stretched from eastern Poland through Krosno and Rzeszów, relying on damaged rail networks and limited depots. Fuel shortages already affected armored operations, and the density of mines slowed movement to less than 2 kilometers per day in the initial approach zones. German supply was hardly better. Allied air raids on Hungarian and Slovak railways limited resupply from the Reich. Nevertheless, the Wehrmacht's defensive organization, smaller, flexible units integrated with artillery and local reserves, allowed rapid adaptation to Soviet pressure. As September approached, intelligence reports on both sides indicated that a decisive confrontation was imminent. Reconnaissance flights over the Dukla region revealed massing Soviet formations near the Polish frontier, while German observers along the main ridge recorded increased artillery calibration and radio traffic. Konev's plan was finalized by the first week of September, a concentrated assault by the 38th Army through Dukla toward Prešov, supported by flanking attacks from the north and the Czechoslovak Route Corps advancing through the lower passes. The morale among the troops reflected both determination and exhaustion. Many Soviet soldiers had marched continuously since the liberation of Lviv and faced the Carpathians with limited rest. The Czechoslovak units, though motivated by the prospect of fighting for their homeland, were understrength and poorly acclimatized to mountain warfare. German units, aware of their numerical disadvantage, relied on the confidence inspired by Heinrich's defensive preparations and the knowledge that every kilometer gained by the enemy meant another layer of fortifications waiting beyond. By early September 1944, both sides had committed themselves to an operation that would combine the most difficult aspects of modern warfare: armored assaults in confined terrain, infantry attrition in forests, and unpredictable weather. The battle that was about to unfold in the Dukla Pass would last far longer than anyone in either command had anticipated. What Soviet planners expected to achieve in 5 days would turn into a brutal 6-week struggle, fought ridge by ridge, under conditions that tested every measure of endurance and command. On the morning of September 8, 1944, the artillery of the Soviet 38th Army opened fire along a 25-kilometer front between Krosno and Sanok. The thunder of more than 3,000 guns echoed through the valleys of southern Poland as the East Carpathian offensive began. Within minutes, the first waves of Soviet infantry advanced toward the ridge lines that marked the approaches to the Dukla Pass. Behind them rolled tanks of the 1st Guards Tank Corps, struggling to maneuver along narrow mountain roads never designed for heavy vehicles. The Red Army's goal was clear: break through the fortified line, reach Prešov within 5 days, and link up with the Slovak insurgents who awaited them beyond the frontier. Initial progress appeared promising. By September 9th, forward detachments had captured several Polish villages, including Tylawa and Barwinek, encountering only screening forces from the German 68th Army Corps. But resistance stiffened rapidly. Heinrich's defense plan called for elastic withdrawal, allowing Soviet units to enter pre-registered killing zones where artillery and mortars could inflict maximum losses. German forward observers, positioned on elevated slopes, directed precise fire on advancing infantry columns. Within 2 days, Soviet battalions reported casualties of up to 30%, and armored units lost dozens of tanks to mines and anti-tank guns before even reaching the main line of defense. The 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps, fighting alongside the Soviets, entered combat near Krosno on September 9th. Its soldiers, many of them exiles returning to their homeland under the Red Star, faced the grim reality of modern warfare in the mountains. Their commander, General Ludwig Svoboda, reported to Konev that terrain and German resistance were far stronger than anticipated. His troops advanced barely 1 kilometer per day under constant artillery and sniper fire. Engineers worked around the clock clearing minefields, while medics evacuated wounded men along steep, muddy paths that quickly became impassable for vehicles. The promised link with Slovak insurgents seemed increasingly unrealistic. By September 10th, the Soviet 38th Army confronted the first major German defensive line. Bunkers reinforced with steel rails and timber blocked the main road to Dukla, supported by the 75th and 97th Jaeger divisions. The defenders used overlapping fields of fire, heavy mortars, and well-camouflaged anti-tank guns to halt the Red Army's momentum. Soviet tank crews found their machines useless in the confined valleys. German artillery observers hidden in forests corrected fire by radio, destroying vehicles one by one as they attempted to climb the slopes. Infantry assaults suffered equally heavy losses. A single German machine gun nest could cover an entire ravine, forcing repeated attacks that yielded only meters of ground at a time. Konev ordered concentrated artillery barrages to smash the defense. For 2 days, from September 11 to 12, Soviet guns shelled the German positions with tens of thousands of shells. Observers noted entire forest sections stripped bare by explosions, yet the line held. German casualties mounted, roughly 3,000 killed or wounded, but their network of trenches and reserve positions prevented collapse. Soviet reports from the 38th Army listed more than 8,000 men lost in the same period, along with 90 tanks and self-propelled guns disabled or destroyed. Still, the offensive continued. Each hill captured by the Soviets revealed another ridge beyond it, another belt of mines and wire, another hidden battery waiting for the next assault. The weather worsened as rain turned mountain paths into swamps. Trucks became stuck in the mud, and ammunition deliveries had to be carried by horse or by hand. Communication lines repeatedly broke under artillery fire, leaving regiments isolated. Air support proved unreliable. Low clouds grounded most aircraft of the 8th Air Army. German defenders took advantage of the poor visibility to launch localized counterattacks, recapturing several hills and capturing prisoners from Soviet forward units. Despite exhaustion, Soviet commanders pressed forward, convinced that persistence alone would wear down the defenders. By mid-September, the Red Army had advanced only 15 kilometers since the start of the offensive. The expected breakthrough to Slovakia remained far away. Civilians caught in the combat zone fled to mountain villages or hid in forests where food shortages and bombardment created a humanitarian crisis. Local Polish and Russian populations suffered heavy losses from artillery fire on both sides. The front had become a grinding attrition battle, fought over ridges whose names would later appear on both Soviet and Czechoslovak memorials: Hill 534, Barwinek Ridge, and the road to Dukla. Among the Soviet staff, frustration grew. Moskalenko's reports to Konev warned that continuous assaults without rest were exhausting his divisions. Yet Konev could not halt the attack. Orders from the Stavka insisted on immediate assistance to the Slovak uprising. German intercepts of Soviet radio traffic confirmed the enemy's urgency, prompting Heinrici to reinforce his positions even further. Elements of the 1st Panzer Division began to move into the area from Hungary, bringing additional armor to the defense. By September 15th, the offensive had stalled. Soviet troops held a precarious line short of the border, their advance measured in hundreds of meters per day. The battle for the Dukla Pass had entered a new phase, no longer a swift liberation campaign, but a prolonged and costly struggle for every hill and ravine in the eastern Carpathians. The strategic objectives set by both commands in early September 1944 revealed a profound divergence in expectation and capability. For the Soviet High Command, Operation Dukla was designed as a swift strike through the Carpathians that would link the Red Army with Slovak insurgents near Prešov. Intelligence estimated that German resistance in the region was thin, composed mainly of rearguard units covering the withdrawal of Army Group North Ukraine. The official directive from the Soviet Stavka ordered Konev's 1st Ukrainian front to reach the Prešov area within 5 days. This plan, conceived in the aftermath of the successful summer offensives in Ukraine and Poland, assumed that the German forces in the Carpathians were demoralized and incapable of sustained defense. In reality, the Germans had transformed the Carpathian frontier into a formidable defensive system known as the Arpad Line. Built initially by Hungarian engineers and later expanded by German units, the line incorporated minefields, anti-tank ditches, and concrete bunkers designed to channel enemy attacks into narrow corridors. Each position was connected by mountain paths that allowed quick movement of reserves and artillery. Heinrici, a specialist in defensive warfare, organized the defense into several echelons, each capable of independent resistance. The 1st Panzer Army, under General Gotthard Heinrich's direct oversight, commanded experienced formations: the 1st Panzer Division, 97th Jaeger Division, and 68th Army Corps, supported by the 1st Hungarian Army. Altogether, approximately 100,000 men occupied the line, with about 1,000 artillery pieces and 200 tanks and assault guns. The Soviets, meanwhile, faced significant logistical challenges before the first shot was fired. The 38th Army and 1st Guards Army had to move through eastern Poland's devastated transport network. Rail bridges destroyed by German demolition teams and Allied bombing forced Soviet engineers to construct temporary routes across the San and Wisłok rivers. Ammunition stocks were limited, and fuel deliveries had to be prioritized for armored units. The Czechoslovak Worm Corps, while politically valuable, lacked heavy artillery and adequate transport. It relied almost entirely on Soviet logistical support. The mountainous terrain amplified every deficiency. A single roadblock or bridge collapse could halt an entire column for hours, sometimes days. German intelligence proved more accurate than the Soviet assessments. Luftwaffe reconnaissance over Krosno and Rzeszów detected massing Soviet formations weeks before the offensive began, allowing Heinrich to prepare fallback lines and pre-sighted artillery zones. By the time the 38th Army began its advance, the defenders were fully alert. Reports from German headquarters in mid-September indicate that their observers registered over 400 Soviet artillery batteries positioned opposite the Dukla sector. As a result, the Germans reinforced their forward lines with mobile anti-tank teams armed with Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks, weapons that would prove deadly in the confined valleys. The strategic doctrines of the two armies also clashed in practice. Soviet deep battle theory favored rapid breakthroughs by massed armor and mechanized infantry, supported by overwhelming artillery fire. This approach had achieved success in open terrain during Operation Bagration, but the Carpathians rendered it ineffective. The steep slopes, narrow ravines, and poor road infrastructure confined movement to a few predictable axes. The Germans, by contrast, emphasized defense in depth, camouflage, and counterattack from concealed positions. Their mountain-trained units, particularly the Jaeger divisions, exploited terrain to ambush Soviet columns and then withdraw before artillery could respond. Propaganda on both sides played a significant role. Soviet broadcasts from Radio Moscow urged Slovak insurgents to hold on until the Red Army arrived. Newspapers of the 38th Army printed optimistic bulletins predicting imminent liberation of Slovakia. Within the German ranks, propaganda emphasized defense of Europe's heartland, portraying the Carpathians as the gate to the Reich. German field reports noted that morale among the defenders remained high, buoyed by confidence in their fortifications and the belief that the mountains themselves favored their cause. Konev's planning meetings at the beginning of the offensive reflected both determination and misunderstanding of the terrain. Maps underestimated the depth of the German defensive network and the density of minefields. Operational orders called for artillery to suppress enemy batteries within hours of the opening barrage, but reconnaissance had failed to identify many of the German gun positions hidden in forests. Soviet commanders, relying on experience from previous offensives, assumed that once the first defensive belt collapsed, the Germans would retreat rapidly. Instead, each captured ridge revealed another line of bunkers and concealed firing positions. The coordination between Soviet and Czechoslovak units added another layer of complexity. While officially subordinated to the First Ukrainian Front, General Svoboda's corps maintained independent communications with Czechoslovak political authorities and was often used for propaganda purposes. Orders sometimes conflicted. Soviet staff prioritized rapid advance at all costs, while Svoboda sought to minimize losses among his men, who viewed the campaign as a symbolic fight for their homeland. The result was operational friction, delayed responses, and occasional miscommunication under fire. The logistical strain worsened daily. Mountain roads became congested with vehicles, artillery, and horse-drawn wagons. Rain and constant shelling turned them into quagmires. Soviet supply officers reported fuel shortages severe enough to immobilize entire tank brigades for lack of diesel. Ammunition expenditure exceeded forecasts by 40% within the first week. In contrast, the German defenders maintained relatively shorter supply routes to depots in eastern Slovakia, though Allied air raids on Hungarian railways began to disrupt deliveries by mid-September. As the offensive continued, the gap between planning and reality grew more apparent. Reports reaching Moscow suggested that the Slovak uprising was faltering under German counterattacks, yet the order to push through the Carpathians remained unchanged. Konev's headquarters, constrained by political pressure to demonstrate solidarity with the insurgents, could not revise its timetable. What had begun as a calculated thrust now turned into an attritional campaign where success was measured not in kilometers gained, but in the endurance of men and machines. By the third week of September, both armies were locked in a deadly balance. The Soviets had committed their main reserves without achieving a breakthrough, while the Germans maintained a firm grip on the high ground. The plans conceived in early September, confident, mathematically precise, and politically ambitious, had collided with the brutal geography of the Carpathians. What remained was a contest of endurance where every decision would be paid for in blood and where strategy itself would be reshaped by the mountain's impassive strength. By September 9-15, the operation had evolved into a sequence of costly engagements that revealed the scale of resistance awaiting the Red Army. The first Soviet and Czechoslovak assaults near the villages of Tilawa, Barwinek, and Zindranowa marked the true beginning of the battle for the Dukla Pass. The Soviet 38th Army launched repeated frontal attacks, attempting to breach the German lines that dominated every ridge and crossroad. Artillery preparation began each day before dawn, followed by waves of infantry advancing through fog and smoke. In some sectors, the Red Army advanced barely 500 meters in a full day of fighting, only to lose the ground again at night to German counterattacks. The German 68th Army Corps, holding the main approaches to Dukla, utilized every advantage the terrain could offer. The 75th and 97th Jaeger divisions, composed of mountain-trained troops, were supported by elements of the 1st Panzer Division equipped with Panthers and Stughi 3 assault guns. These armored units were deployed not in open combat, but as mobile fire brigades, counterattacking wherever Soviet breakthroughs seemed imminent. German artillery, positioned on reverse slopes, achieved remarkable precision. Soviet after-action reports recorded that up to 60% of their tank losses in the first week came from concealed anti-tank guns rather than direct confrontation. Czechoslovak units fighting alongside the Soviets experienced some of the fiercest opposition. The 1st Czechoslovak Brigade, led by Colonel Vladimir Psykril, advanced into the narrow valley near Dukla village under heavy fire. The brigade, numbering about 3,500 men at the start of the offensive, lost nearly one-third of its strength in the first week. Despite these losses, it succeeded in capturing several German outposts and securing the village of Vyshny Komarnik, the first Czechoslovak settlement liberated after 5 years of occupation. This symbolic achievement was immediately overshadowed by the scale of the casualties required to achieve it. German command coordination remained effective throughout this phase. Heinrici directed operations from his forward headquarters near Prešov, issuing flexible defense orders that allowed local commanders to abandon positions temporarily and counterattack when Soviet forces overextended. These tactics repeatedly threw Soviet infantry into confusion. The Red Army's rigid adherence to pre-planned artillery timetables meant that fire often fell behind or ahead of the moving front, creating gaps the defenders exploited. The result was a deadly rhythm: assault, counter-assault, and renewed bombardment, each leaving hundreds of bodies scattered across the ravines. Weather conditions worsened steadily. Heavy rain and fog reduced visibility to less than 100 meters, grounding most Soviet aircraft and limiting artillery observation. Mud clogged tank treads and immobilized supply vehicles. The 1st Guards Tank Corps reported that of its 120 operational tanks, only 45 remained mobile after the first 10 days due to mechanical failures and terrain damage. Crews resorted to using logs and explosives to clear blocked roads, often under sniper and mortar fire. German minefields, sometimes extending for hundreds of meters, forced engineers to crawl forward with primitive mine detectors while under constant shelling. By September 15th, Soviet losses exceeded 8,000 killed or wounded in the Dukla sector alone. German and Hungarian casualties reached about 3,000, but their defensive positions remained largely intact. Prisoners taken by Soviet reconnaissance units revealed the presence of multiple fallback lines stretching several kilometers deep, evidence that the enemy intended to hold the pass for as long as possible. The Red Army's optimistic schedule of advancing through the mountains in a week had already collapsed. Civilian populations in nearby villages suffered heavily. Continuous bombardment destroyed homes and farms, forcing residents to flee into forests. German forces evacuated able-bodied men for labor duties, while Soviet artillery frequently struck populated areas used by the enemy for supply storage. Reports from local Polish and Lemko communities recorded hundreds of civilian deaths and widespread displacement. The human cost extended far beyond the soldiers fighting in the mud and rain. The terrain itself shaped the character of every engagement. Hills such as 534, 706, and 694 became names etched into both armies' operational maps, symbols of local victories and losses that changed little on the broader front. Each of these heights commanded a view of valleys below, making them critical to artillery control. Battles for single hilltops often lasted for days, with troops advancing under point-blank fire, retreating, and attacking again. The soil was littered with burnt-out tanks, shattered trees, and uncollected bodies that made further fighting even harder. German reports from the 97th Jaeger Division noted the exhaustion of their men, but emphasized the strength of defensive morale. Soldiers understood that the Carpathians were the last natural line before the Hungarian plain. For them, each day of delay meant more time for Germany to reinforce defenses further west. The Soviet soldiers, meanwhile, were driven by conflicting impulses, duty to press forward and disbelief at the intensity of resistance. Konev's staff urged constant momentum, warning that hesitation would doom the Slovak uprising already under pressure from German reinforcements. In these first engagements, both armies learned the grim reality of mountain warfare. Firepower could devastate but rarely conquer. Maneuver was almost impossible, and each unit fought in isolation within valleys and forests where radio communication failed and resupply was sporadic. By the middle of September, the Soviet front line had advanced less than 15 kilometers from its start point. Yet this narrow strip of blood and mud had consumed thousands of lives, drained fuel and ammunition reserves, and revealed the strength of German defenses in the Carpathians. The Red Army now faced a stark truth. The road to Slovakia would not be opened by speed or massed assault, but by relentless attrition, one ridge, one ravine, one shattered battalion at a time. By mid-September 1944, the battle for the Dukla Pass entered its most desperate phase. The initial momentum of the Soviet and Czechoslovak advance had been spent, and what remained was a brutal contest of attrition fought across forests, ridgelines, and narrow mountain roads. Reinforcements on both sides turned the once limited engagement into a major regional battle involving more than 250,000 men. On September 16th, the Soviet 38th Army renewed its offensive with heavy artillery preparation, deploying over 3,000 guns and mortars. The bombardment lasted 6 hours and consumed more than 100,000 shells. When the guns fell silent, infantry from the 305th and 312th Rifle Divisions surged forward into thick fog, advancing toward Dukla village. The German defense system, however, remained largely intact. Heinrici had reinforced the front with the 1st Panzer Division and elements of the 24th Panzer Division arriving from reserves in Hungary. These formations, though understrength, brought new armored support and experienced officers. German field engineers strengthened secondary positions and created new obstacles, tree barriers, anti-tank ditches, and additional mine belts. The defenders adapted to Soviet tactics by using short-range ambushes. Small teams equipped with Panzerfausts waited in the woods, striking tanks at close distance before disappearing into the terrain. the Soviets countered with overwhelming artillery fire and close infantry support, attempting to clear each ridge by storm. The battle for Hill 534, located just north of Dukla village, became the symbol of this phase. Between September 16th and 20th, Soviet troops attacked the hill 9 times. Each assault began with a concentrated barrage, followed by infantry advancing through destroyed woodland. German positions on the summit, defended by machine guns and mortars, repelled every attempt. Soviet after-action reports noted losses of more than 1,200 men and 20 tanks in 4 days of fighting for that single height. German records show their own heavy toll. Approximately 600 casualties, with entire platoons wiped out under bombardment. Meanwhile, the Czechoslovak Corps continued its push on the southern flank. Its units were tasked with capturing the road to Svidnik and linking up with the 38th Army. The 1st Brigade advanced through dense forests where visibility dropped to a few meters. Rain and constant artillery fire made resupply nearly impossible. Ammunition was carried manually up steep slopes, while field kitchens operated in open trenches. Medical evacuation was limited. Wounded soldiers often remained in makeshift shelters for days. Despite these conditions, morale among the Czechoslovak troops remained high. Many saw themselves as fighting on home soil for the first time since 1939. German command faced its own challenges. The continuous pressure of Soviet artillery forced constant rotation of frontline units. By the 3rd week of September, the 97th Jaeger Division had lost nearly 40% of its manpower. Ammunition shortages became critical, with artillery units limited to firing rationed salvos. Luftwaffe support was minimal. Weather and Soviet air superiority reduced flight operations to reconnaissance missions. Still, the defenders maintained cohesion. Heinrich's operational reports emphasized the necessity of holding the mountain passes until the last feasible moment to prevent Soviet forces from flooding into Slovakia. The terrain and weather increasingly favored the defenders. The Carpathians' dense forests neutralized the Soviet advantage in armor and artillery. Fog, rain, and low clouds grounded air support for days. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft that managed to fly were often met by concentrated anti-aircraft fire from hidden positions. Every attempt to flank German strongpoints required climbing steep, muddy slopes under fire. Infantry companies advanced in single file along narrow paths, making them easy targets for artillery. Progress could only be measured in meters. Civilian suffering mounted as the front stagnated. Villages such as Dukla, Tilawa, and Barwinek were reduced to ruins. Hundreds of civilians were killed or displaced as both sides used homes for shelter or strongpoints. Supply shortages caused famine in nearby valleys, where local populations scavenged burned-out vehicles and abandoned rations. Reports from Soviet field hospitals record outbreaks of disease among soldiers and civilians alike, worsened by contaminated water and decomposing corpses left in the open. Political pressure on Konev intensified. The Slovak national uprising, which had inspired the offensive, was faltering. German reinforcements were crushing insurgent centers around Banska Bystrica. Stalin's directive, however, remained unchanged. Soviet forces must break through to Slovakia, regardless of cost. On September 20th, Konev ordered a general assault along the entire sector. The 38th Army's infantry advanced again, supported by the 1st Guards Tank Corps, while the 8th Air Army resumed limited sorties when weather allowed. The bombardment preceding this attack was among the heaviest yet, but it achieved little strategic gain. The Soviets captured a few villages north of the pass but failed to dislodge the main German positions. In these weeks, morale and exhaustion began to dictate the tempo more than strategy. Soviet soldiers endured continuous combat with little rotation or rest. German troops, though equally strained, fought with the knowledge that delay alone could constitute victory. By late September, the Soviet advance had stalled within artillery range of the Slovak border. Hill 534 still remained under German control, and Dukla Pass itself was yet to be crossed. The escalating losses reflected the intensity of the struggle. Soviet sources estimate over 20,000 casualties by September's end, while German and Hungarian forces suffered around 10,000. Equipment losses were enormous. 400 Soviet tanks and self-propelled guns disabled, about 100 German armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned. Both sides faced the limits of endurance amid unrelenting rain, mud, and shell fire. By the final days of September, the Dukla sector had become a graveyard of armor and men. Soviet supply convoys crawled through mountain roads, lined with wrecked vehicles, while German defenders clung to shrinking perimeters, determined to hold until ordered to retreat. The campaign's swift timetable had collapsed entirely. The Carpathians had swallowed the armies sent to conquer them, and neither side yet realized that the battle was only halfway through its deadly course. By the end of September 1944, the battle for the Dukla Pass reached its height. What had begun as a limited offensive turned into one of the most intense mountain operations of the Eastern Front. Both armies were exhausted, yet neither could withdraw. The Soviet 38th Army, reinforced by elements of the 1st Guards Army, prepared one final concentrated effort to seize the pass and open the road into Slovakia. German forces, reorganized under the 1st Panzer Army and supported by the Hungarian 1st Army, were determined to hold every ridge until the last possible moment. Between September 25th and October 5th, the fighting reached a level of violence and attrition unseen in any previous phase of the campaign. Soviet artillery opened the new phase with a bombardment that lasted nearly an entire day. More than 4,000 guns and mortars fired over 200,000 shells into German defensive positions across a 30-kilometer front. Hills 534, 706, and 694, names that by now had become synonymous with loss, were pounded without pause. Forests were reduced to stumps, the ground churned into mud, mixed with splinters and fragments of metal. Yet when the Soviet infantry advanced, the machine guns still opened fire. Heinrich's defenses had survived, in part due to the German practice of constructing deep bunkers into the rock and placing reserves on reverse slopes, protected from direct hits. The 38th Army's renewed attack began on September 27th, with the 305th and 312th Rifle Divisions supported by the 1st Guards Tank Corps. Their objective was the direct capture of Dukla village and the adjacent pass road. Soviet engineers cleared mines and repaired bridges under fire, enabling the first wave of tanks to move forward. The German 1st Panzer Division countered almost immediately, launching counterattacks from the forests north of Svidnik. In the confined valleys, these clashes turned into chaotic duels at point-blank range. Soviet T-34s and German Panthers exchanged fire at distances under 300 meters, often through dense fog or rain. When visibility failed, combat devolved into short-range ambushes, with infantry using grenades and flamethrowers to clear enemy positions hidden in ravines. The Czechoslovak Weser Corps fought on the southern flank, pushing toward Svidnik to outflank the main pass. Between September 28th and October 3rd, its brigades assaulted the fortified line known as the Valley of Death. The 1st and 3rd Brigades advanced repeatedly across open fields under artillery fire. Casualties were catastrophic. Out of approximately 16,000 Czechoslovak troops engaged during the offensive, nearly 6,500 were killed or wounded by the end of September. In one day of combat near Kapishova, the 1st Brigade lost more than half its officers. Still, the Corps pressed on, capturing the ridges overlooking Svidnik on October 1st. Meanwhile, the Soviet 8th Air Army returned to active support as the weather cleared temporarily. PE-2 bombers and Il-2 ground attack aircraft struck German artillery positions, supply depots, and columns retreating along the Slovak border. Soviet reports claimed the destruction of over 200 vehicles and dozens of gun emplacements, though German records confirm significantly fewer losses. Luftwaffe fighter presence was minimal, limited to small detachments operating from airfields near Prešov. Despite air superiority, the Soviets found little advantage. The broken terrain and deep forests limited the accuracy of bombing, and many strikes fell on already ruined positions. As October began, both sides suffered from collapsing logistics. For the Soviets, ammunition stocks dwindled as rail lines far behind the front became congested. Engineers worked night and day to maintain the few viable roads across the mountains, but torrential rain returned, washing away bridges and cutting communications. German units were in no better condition. The 97th Jaeger Division reported that its infantry battalions were down to 150 men each, with almost no replacements. Medical evacuation was nearly impossible. Wounded soldiers were often left in caves or forest shelters where they succumbed to exposure or infection. The capture of Hill 534 finally came on October 5th after 3 weeks of continuous combat. The Soviet 305th Rifle Division, supported by heavy artillery and sappers, stormed the hill under cover of fog. By evening, the last German defenders withdrew, leaving behind dozens of dead and wrecked guns. The cost, however, was devastating. Over 1,000 Soviet soldiers killed or wounded in a single day for control of a height less than 600 meters above sea level. The Red Army had at last taken the key observation point overlooking the Dukla Valley, but the pass itself remained contested. German command attempted to stabilize the line further south. The 1st Panzer Division conducted counterattacks on October 6-7, retaking portions of the road and temporarily halting Soviet supply columns. These actions, though tactically minor, demonstrated that the German forces, though reduced, still retained combat capability. Soviet commanders described the enemy's discipline as unyielding, noting that even encircled detachments fought until annihilation. Civilians who had remained in the mountain villages now faced total destruction. The town of Dukla ceased to exist as a functioning settlement. Nearly every building was destroyed by artillery. Survivors fled into the forests, where hunger and disease spread rapidly. Field reports from both armies mention abandoned livestock, burning granaries, and bodies buried hastily in roadside trenches. By the second week of October, the strategic picture began to shift. Despite heavy losses, the Red Army had finally breached the main German defensive belt and secured positions within Slovak territory. The Dukla Pass itself was under Soviet artillery control, though not yet cleared of mines or rearguards. German High Command ordered gradual withdrawal to secondary lines near Svidnik and Prešov to preserve manpower. The Soviets pressed forward, aware that the long-awaited link with the Slovak insurgents was already impossible. The uprising had been crushed in late September. The peak of the campaign thus marked both triumph and futility. The Red Army's persistence had forced a breakthrough after nearly a month of continuous fighting, but the operational objectives that had justified the offensive no longer existed. The German forces, though driven back, had achieved their purpose, delaying the Soviet advance long enough to destroy the uprising and reinforce the defense of central Slovakia. The mountains had consumed the offensive's momentum, leaving behind a landscape of devastation and silence. The battle's climax did not bring liberation, but exhaustion, setting the stage for the long and bitter struggle that would continue into October's final weeks. By mid-October 1944, the armies fighting in the Dukla sector had adapted to a rhythm of attrition and survival. The grand objectives that had once guided the operation were replaced by local improvisation, endurance, and the determination to outlast the enemy. The Soviets, having forced a breach through the main German defenses, faced the challenge of consolidating their gains in terrain that offered little room for maneuver. German forces, though battered, continued to resist through elastic defense and small-scale counterattacks that exploited every fold of the Carpathian landscape. The battle was no longer about rapid advance or sweeping movements. It was a struggle for endurance between units exhausted by weeks of continuous combat. Marshal Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front reorganized its forward units in early October. The 38th Army, still the main assault formation, received fresh reinforcements, the 67th Rifle Corps and additional artillery brigades. Their task was to clear remaining German positions north of the Dukla Pass and secure the valleys leading toward Svidnik and Ladomirova. Supply remained the principal obstacle. Roads were blocked by wrecked vehicles, and the persistent rain turned every slope into mud. Soviet logistics officers resorted to horse teams and human porters to carry shells, fuel, and rations up to the forward lines. In some areas, Battalions went without hot food for days, surviving on cold rations and melted snow. The Czechoslovak Warm Corps, now under the operational control of General Svoboda but still subordinated to Konev, restructured its forces for prolonged mountain warfare. Engineers created mule trails and improvised cableways to transport ammunition across ravines. Infantry platoons learned to advance in small groups using natural cover rather than frontal formations. The Corps' artillery, short on shells, shifted to precision fire directed by forward observers positioned on captured peaks. Despite these innovations, progress remained painfully slow. By October 10th, Czechoslovak units had advanced barely 5 kilometers beyond the pass, suffering hundreds of casualties from sniper and mortar fire. German command recognized that the Soviets, though inside Slovak territory, lacked the strength for a decisive push. Heinrici ordered his divisions to establish new defensive positions on the slopes south of Svidnik. These lines consisted mainly of field fortifications and natural barriers, reinforced by remnants of the 1st Panzer and 97th Jaeger divisions. The German plan was to delay the enemy's approach to the Prešov Basin long enough to complete the destruction of the Slovak insurgency further west. Reinforcements from Hungary, including elements of the 20th Panzer Division and Hungarian border regiments, arrived piecemeal, immediately thrown into defensive sectors. Fighting during this period became highly fragmented. Engagements occurred around individual hills, road junctions, or river crossings, rather than along a continuous front. Artillery duels echoed day and night as both sides targeted supply points and suspected command posts. Soviet reconnaissance units reported that German observers had installed telephone lines linking every major hilltop, allowing them to coordinate artillery fire with remarkable precision. This system proved costly to the Soviets. Several entire battalions were annihilated by pre-registered bombardments before reaching enemy lines. To overcome these defenses, Soviet commanders introduced new tactics. Night assaults became frequent, relying on bayonets and hand grenades to minimize the effect of German artillery. Flamethrower teams were deployed to clear bunkers and caves. Engineers experimented with improvised bridges across ravines, while snipers targeted machine gun positions hidden in the forest canopy. These adaptations gradually eroded the cohesion of the German front. Reports from the 97th Jaeger Division noted increasing shortages of ammunition and food, and the difficulty of replacing lost men. Yet morale remained steady. The soldiers understood the strategic value of every day they could delay the Soviet advance. The weather turned harsher as autumn deepened. Temperatures dropped below freezing at night, and morning fog reduced visibility to almost zero. Soviet medical reports described growing numbers of frostbite and respiratory illnesses. Artillery pieces had to be thawed with burning rags before firing, and rifles jammed from moisture and mud. German units suffered the same conditions, with supply lines stretched across ruined roads and continuous Soviet bombardment. Both sides began using abandoned houses as makeshift shelters. Villages like Nizhny Komarnik and Kapishova became field fortresses filled with rubble and corpses. Partisan activity increased behind German lines, although its impact on the overall campaign was limited. Local Slovak resistance groups and remnants of the crushed uprising harassed convoys and attacked isolated outposts. Soviet liaison officers attempted to coordinate these efforts, but communication was unreliable and reprisals were severe. German counterinsurgency patrols executed captured partisans and suspected collaborators, deepening the terror that hung over the civilian population. The mountainous terrain, with its forests and caves, offered cover but also isolation. Many partisans perished from exposure or starvation as the front moved slowly westward. Psychological strain weighed heavily on the troops. Soviet political officers reported growing fatigue and fatalism among rifle divisions. Letters intercepted by censors revealed soldiers' disbelief that the offensive could continue through the winter. German diaries captured a similar tone, entries describing endless artillery fire, sleepless nights, and the impression that the mountains themselves have become our enemy. Commanders on both sides struggled to maintain cohesion through strict discipline and rotation of frontline companies when possible, though there were few fresh reserves left to replace them. By October 15th, The Red Army had captured Svidnik after a week of close combat. The town, reduced to rubble, marked the deepest Soviet penetration into Slovakia at that point. German forces withdrew to secondary lines near Hunkovce and Ladomirova, fighting delaying actions with small armored detachments. The 38th Army's pursuit was cautious, slowed by mines and destroyed bridges. Soviet engineers cleared more than 10,000 mines in this sector alone during October. Behind them, the Czechoslovak Corps secured the pass area and began reorganizing for further advance toward Prešov. The battle's adaptive phase had shown both sides resilience and ingenuity, but also the futility of continued bloodshed. The Soviets could now claim partial success. The Dukla Pass had been crossed, and the Red Army was on Slovak soil. Yet the price of that achievement, tens of thousands of casualties, exhausted divisions, and the destruction of entire towns, underscored that the offensive had lost its original purpose. The uprising they had set out to relieve was already extinguished. In its place remained a landscape of ruins, and soldiers too weary to celebrate, locked in a war of endurance that the Carpathians themselves seemed determined to prolong. By the third week of October 1944, the outcome of the Dukla campaign began to take shape. The Soviet 38th Army and the Czechoslovak Third Corps had finally broken through the main defensive belts and entered northern Slovakia, but at a cost that strained their combat effectiveness to the limit. For the German 1st Panzer Army, the order to conduct an organized withdrawal was issued on October 18th. General Heinrici understood that the defense of the Dukla line could no longer be sustained. Casualties, ammunition shortages, and logistical collapse made further resistance impossible. Yet his retreat would not resemble a rout. Instead, he intended to fight a controlled withdrawal, using rearguard actions and prepared fallback lines to slow the Soviet advance and buy time for the reorganization of forces deeper inside Slovakia. The terrain continued to dictate every movement. The narrow valleys south of Svidnik and Hunkovce became corridors of smoke and wreckage, littered with destroyed vehicles and abandoned guns. Soviet forward units advanced cautiously, wary of ambushes and mines. German sappers mined bridges and crossroads before retreating, forcing Soviet engineers to work under constant shell fire to clear passages. Each kilometer gained required hours of effort. Artillery from both sides pounded the same hills repeatedly, reducing forests to fields of craters. Civilians trapped in the combat zone moved through these wastelands, carrying what few belongings remained. The Czechoslovak Fur Corps, following in the wake of the 38th Army, encountered fierce resistance from isolated German groups determined to delay the advance. The fight for the village of Hunkovce became one of the bloodiest engagements of this phase. On October 19th, Czechoslovak infantry launched a frontal assault supported by Soviet artillery. German machine guns and mortars, hidden in basements and stone fences, inflicted severe losses. After 3 days of street fighting, the village changed hands several times. When it was finally secured on October 22nd, it no longer existed as a settlement. Every house burned, the cemetery shattered, and bodies buried beneath collapsed walls. As the Red Army advanced deeper into Slovakia, the scope of the operation expanded beyond the immediate battlefield. The First Ukrainian Front sought to exploit the breach through Dukla by launching a broader offensive toward Prešov and Košice. However, the units that had fought in the mountains were no longer capable of sustained movement. Many rifle divisions were operating at 1/3 of their authorized strength. Tank brigades had fewer than 20 operational vehicles each, and artillery batteries reported barrel wear so severe that accuracy dropped significantly. Fuel shortages persisted, and roads destroyed by weather and bombardment turned every logistical movement into a struggle. German resistance during withdrawal was tenacious and organized. Heinrichi's staff implemented a system of sequential defenses, where one division would hold a line while another withdrew to the next prepared position. This method preserved unit cohesion and continued to exact a heavy price on Soviet attackers. The 1st Panzer Division, although reduced to fewer than 40 operational tanks, conducted effective counterattacks that delayed the Soviet advance by several days. Hungarian troops, operating under German command, covered the southern flank and defended key road junctions near Stropkov. Air operations intensified briefly as weather cleared. Soviet bombers from the 8th Air Army targeted German supply columns and transport hubs, while reconnaissance aircraft provided real-time intelligence on the movement of retreating forces. Luftwaffe activity, though limited, focused on interdiction strikes against Soviet bridges and artillery concentrations. On October 20, 23, several Soviet pontoon bridges across the Leberek River were destroyed by German air raids, causing temporary delays. Nevertheless, the Luftwaffe's contribution could not alter the general course of events. The German retreat continued westward, step by step, under unrelenting Soviet pressure. By late October, the front line stretched into central Slovakia. The Red Army occupied Svidnik, Ladomirova, and Hunkovce, while reconnaissance patrols pushed toward Prešov. The terrain began to open into rolling hills and valleys, favoring Soviet artillery deployment, but still complicating logistics. Communication between the 38th Army and neighboring formations of the First Ukrainian Front remained intermittent due to damaged infrastructure. Commanders in the field frequently relied on runners and liaison officers to transmit orders, as radio communication was disrupted by the mountainous environment and atmospheric conditions. The human toll of the campaign became evident in captured documents and after-action reports. German field hospitals recorded over 52,000 casualties during the operation, including dead, wounded, and missing. Soviet and Czechoslovak losses were even higher, estimated at more than 85,000 killed, wounded, or missing. The 1st Czechoslovak Corps alone had lost over 6,500 men, nearly half its initial strength. The scale of attrition had transformed what was intended as a quick liberation into one of the costliest mountain battles of the entire Eastern Front. For civilians, the end of fighting brought little relief. Villages along the front were destroyed and entire populations displaced. Fields were mined, livestock killed, and infrastructure obliterated. Local accounts from survivors described roads lined with burned tanks and bodies left unburied for weeks. The Soviet rear services began organizing the removal of the wounded and the burial of the dead, yet the scope of devastation overwhelmed all available resources. Disease spread rapidly among soldiers and refugees, and food shortages persisted into the winter. By the end of October, the German 1st Panzer Army completed its withdrawal to new positions west of Prešov, establishing a temporary defensive line to protect access to the Hungarian plains. The Red Army declared the Dukla operation concluded. In strategic terms, the Soviets had achieved their objective, the crossing of the Carpathians and the establishment of a bridgehead in Slovakia. Yet, in operational and human terms, the cost far outweighed the gains. The Slovak national uprising, which the offensive had sought to rescue, had already been suppressed. The Red Army stood victorious, but hollowed by losses. The Dukla Pass, once seen as the gateway to liberation, had become a symbol of endurance and sacrifice, its ridges littered with wreckage that testified to the price of every meter conquered. By the final week of October 1944, the battle for the Dukla Pass had effectively ended as an operational campaign, yet the fighting did not cease entirely. Rearguard clashes, counterattacks, and the clearance of minefields continued well into November, leaving the Carpathian foothills scarred and haunted by the remnants of armies that had bled themselves dry. Both the Soviet 38th Army and the German 1st Panzer Army were shadows of their former strength. Exhaustion, disease, and logistical collapse had replaced strategy as the defining forces shaping events on the ground. The Soviet 38th Army reported the liberation of the Dukla Pass and surrounding areas by October 25th, but its divisions were in no condition to continue an immediate pursuit. Casualties had reduced some rifle units to half their authorized numbers, and the condition of roads made resupply nearly impossible. Ammunition deliveries were delayed by as much as 5 days due to destroyed bridges and constant mudslides. Fuel shortages forced tank brigades to abandon immobile vehicles that could not be towed out of mountain ravines. Field reports from the 1st Guards Tank Corps mentioned that out of the 250 armored vehicles that began the offensive in early September, Fewer than 60 remained operational by the end of October. German forces, though retreating, managed to maintain cohesion throughout the withdrawal. Heinrizi's meticulous command style ensured that each rearguard action was carefully timed, denying the Soviets the opportunity to exploit openings. The 1st Panzer Division, reduced to a fraction of its original strength, served as the backbone of these delaying operations. German engineers continued to use demolitions to destroy key infrastructure, bridges, tunnels, and railway lines along the Prešov corridor. In many cases, these demolitions were carried out under direct Soviet fire, a testament to the discipline of the retreating troops. By early November, most German forces had regrouped around Prešov and Košice, where they began fortifying a new line known as the Western Carpathian Shield. For the Czechoslovak One Corps, the conclusion of the campaign was bittersweet. The Corps had crossed onto its homeland, fulfilling a symbolic promise of return, but the cost was staggering. Nearly 50% of its initial strength had been lost in the 6 weeks of fighting. Its commander, General Ludwig Svoboda, described the operation in his report to Moscow as a victory drenched in blood. Units that began the campaign as brigades were reduced to battalions, and some battalions to companies. Still, the Corps continued to hold its sector of the front, manning defensive lines and aiding local reconstruction efforts in devastated Slovak villages. The immediate aftermath in the Dukla region was one of complete devastation. The valleys were filled with burnt-out tanks, shattered artillery pieces, and the remains of thousands of soldiers from both sides. Entire forests were leveled by shellfire. Villages such as Kapishova, Vyshny Komarnik, and Hunkovce had ceased to exist in their pre-war form. Only cellars and fragments of walls marked where homes had stood. Local survivors, returning from hiding in the forests, found fields mined and water sources contaminated. Both Soviet and Czechoslovak military authorities organized extensive mine-clearing operations, but explosions continued to claim lives for months after the battle. Medical services on both sides were overwhelmed. Soviet field hospitals established near Sanok and Krosno treated tens of thousands of wounded under primitive conditions. Many died of infections or exposure before evacuation could be arranged. German hospitals in Prešov and Košice faced similar conditions, with trains full of wounded delayed for days by damaged railways. The Red Cross attempted to mediate the exchange of medical supplies through neutral intermediaries, but communications breakdowns rendered most efforts ineffective. Strategically, the Dukla operation achieved its stated goal of opening a passage through the Carpathians and establishing Soviet forces inside Slovakia. However, the broader objective, linking up with the Slovak insurgents and securing a rapid advance toward Central Europe, was a failure. The uprising had been crushed in late September, and German reinforcements had restored control over much of Slovakia before the Soviets even reached the frontier. The Red Army's advance slowed dramatically after the Dukla operation, shifting focus toward preparing for the next phase, the assault on Budapest. For the German High Command, the withdrawal from Dukla was recognized as a tactical success within a strategic defeat. Heinrizi's ability to extract his forces intact allowed the Wehrmacht to stabilize the front for another 2 months, delaying Soviet penetration into central Slovakia and northern Hungary. Yet this defensive success could not conceal the broader reality. The loss of the Carpathian barrier exposed the heart of Central Europe to invasion. The Wehrmacht's capacity to resist large-scale offensives was eroding irreversibly. Among the soldiers who fought in the campaign, the sense of finality was palpable. Soviet veterans later recalled the eerie silence that followed the last German withdrawal from the ridges, the first moment of quiet after 6 weeks of continuous bombardment. For the Czechoslovak troops, the sight of their homeland brought no celebration, only fatigue and mourning. German survivors of the 97th Jaeger Division, writing after the war, described Dukla as a graveyard in the clouds, where entire battalions vanished without trace. In November, the Soviets began limited reconstruction of the Dukla Road, using captured German prisoners and local labor. The route soon became a logistical artery for supplies flowing south into Slovakia and Hungary, Along its length, countless graves were marked with temporary wooden crosses. Later, mass burial sites would be established, but at that time, the dead still lay scattered across the mountains, buried hastily or not at all. Snow began to fall by mid-November, covering the scars of battle and preserving the silence that followed. By then, the strategic map of Eastern Europe had changed irrevocably. The Red Army now held a continuous line from the Baltic to the Balkans, while the German armies in the east were increasingly fragmented. The Dukla Pass, once a gateway fiercely contested, had become a rear sector of a new front stretching toward Budapest and Vienna. For the German side, the withdrawal through Dukla represented a disciplined, if costly, defensive success. Heinrich's 1st Panzer Army suffered around 50,000 casualties, including wounded and missing, yet preserved its command structure and much of its heavy weaponry. This preservation allowed the Wehrmacht to stabilize a new line along the northern Slovak frontier and to regroup for subsequent defensive battles in Hungary and southern Poland. The delay imposed by the Dukla operation bought the German High Command several critical weeks to fortify Budapest and prepare for the coming Soviet offensives along the Danube. Strategically, it was a temporary reprieve, but one purchased at immense human cost. The civilian landscape of eastern Slovakia and southern Poland was left in ruin. Villages such as Vyshny Komarnik, Kapišova, and Hunkovce had been completely destroyed, their populations decimated. Official histories emphasize the bravery of the Czechoslovak I Corps and the symbolism of crossing onto homeland soil under the red flag. For decades, school textbooks and memorials in both Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union presented Dukla as an example of international solidarity and fraternal sacrifice. In military history, however, the Dukla campaign remains a case study in the challenges of mountain warfare. The operation exposed the limitations of Soviet deep battle doctrine when applied to confined terrain. The mass use of armor and artillery, effective on open plains, proved inefficient in narrow valleys where movement and coordination were nearly impossible. Soviet commanders underestimated both the natural defenses of the Carpathians and the capacity of German forces to improvise successive lines of resistance. With the collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, historians re-examined the operation with greater objectivity. Archival evidence revealed the extent of Soviet political pressure that had driven the offensive, even after field commanders warned of unrealistic timelines and inadequate intelligence. New research also highlighted the role of the Slovak civilians and partisans who suffered between two advancing armies. Modern scholarship now portrays the battle for the Dukla Pass not merely as a military operation, but as a human tragedy, an episode that reflected both the determination and the cost of liberation. Today, the Dukla Pass stands as one of the most solemn military sites in Central Europe. The forests have regrown, and the trenches are covered by moss, yet the traces of war remain visible. Rusted tank hulls, concrete bunkers, and the outlines of mass graves scattered across the ridges. For visitors, the landscape conveys the enormity of what occurred there far more than any monument could. The silence of the mountains contrasts with the historical memory they contain, a silence that speaks of endurance, sacrifice, and the futility of war fought beyond its original purpose. In the larger context of the Second World War, Dukla's significance lies not in territorial conquest, but in its symbolic and humanitarian dimensions. It demonstrated the reach of the Soviet war machine into Central Europe and marked the beginning of the end for German dominance in the region. Yet it also revealed the fragility of alliances and the immense price of liberation. For the soldiers who fought there, Russians, Ukrainians, Czechs, Slovaks, Germans, and Hungarians alike, the battle was not a story of glory, but of survival against the elements, the enemy, and exhaustion itself.